Welcome all of you. I recently came back from a trip to Hanoi and I picked up this at a wonderful little propaganda poster shop. How many of you have been to Vietnam? Okay, good. There's a little, I don't speak Vietnamese, but there's a convenient translation here that says, the national empires and reaction shouldn't unwise touch this country. A little bit awkward there. But clearly a symbol of resistance to foreign forces. But what I found particularly intriguing about this poster is the date, 1978. So this is after the war against the United States. But it's still a very militaristic symbol of resistance against whom? What was happening in Vietnam in 1978? We'll get to that in a moment. My assignment was to talk about the Vietnam War in Asian history, in the context of Asian history. But as I delved more deeply into this subject, it occurred to me that what might be useful for this class is a shift of emphasis away from examining the war in Vietnam as part of American history, which is the way most Americans understand it still today, and to put the war, which in Vietnam is called the American War, into the context of Southeast Asian and specifically Vietnamese history. And if we look at it from that perspective, we see the war, which looms extraordinarily large in our understanding of this history, of the history of the United States and the world, is actually a rather small segment of a much longer history, first of all, of conflict in Vietnam and on the Indochinese Peninsula, and even more broadly in the long history of Vietnam itself. So I want to look at that war in those two contexts, and I will get toward the end to the American War, or to the Vietnam-American War, which is a term I would like to use for it today. But I want to back up and get a rather long-term perspective on the overall history of this region and of this country called Vietnam, as the Vietnamese government kept reminding Americans for many years as a process of normalization dragged on to the 1990s. Vietnam is a country, not a war. And that is still something I think worth keeping in mind today, more than 30 years after the war between the United States and anti-US, anti-South Vietnamese forces has ended. I also wanted to touch on, toward the end of the talk, about how the war or wars are remembered both in the United States, in Vietnam, which of course is now unified under the Hanoi government, and to a limited extent, which is because it is not something I am deeply familiar with, the Vietnamese diaspora, Vietnamese outside of Vietnam, particularly in the United States. We are re-examining, those of us in the field of history, particularly those who focus on Vietnamese history specifically, which I do not. My interest came to Vietnam rather indirectly through my work on Korea, which is reflected in the article that that you have seen in your reading. There has been a re-examination of the kind of accepted narratives of this history recently in the scholarship on the history of Vietnam. There are multiple ways in which this history can be remembered, and certain things which we, from various sides of the conflict, took for granted are now being re-examined in new ways. And in particular, this narrative of nationalism and of the Vietnamese nation, and of this history being a history of conflict between a sort of timeless Vietnamese essence and foreign threats. We still find this today in Hanoi, since it is obviously, in a certain sense, the underpinning of the legitimacy of the regime, but also in still much of the common understanding and even the scholarship on the Vietnam War, that Vietnam is a history of continuous resistance against foreign invasion, against the Chinese, against the French, against the Americans. That is not to say that these events are not part of history. It's not to say that there wasn't resistance and there wasn't conflict, and that there is not a strong sense of national unity and nationalism in Vietnam. There certainly is. But simply that we are now at a point where we are some removed from the war and the kinds of issues that the war brought to the forefront, both in Vietnam and the United States. And we are able to look at some of the more complicated stories of the history within Vietnam, the history of the relations of Vietnam with its neighbors and with the European powers and with the United States. But I don't want to get too much into this. Again, this is not my particular field. I'm not a historian of Vietnam. It is something that I've come to through fascination with this particular period that you are studying in this course. And I have become, as it were, somewhat of an amateur, a dabbler in the history of Vietnam, but also in a comparative perspective, having been trained in the history of East Asia, both China and Korea. I find a great deal of comparative richness in looking at the history of Vietnam from that perspective. When I was in Hanoi a few weeks ago, I attached myself to a Princeton group which attended a lecture in Van Mu, the Confucian Temple, the Temple of Literature, by a very prominent Vietnamese historian. The lecture was called 3,000 Years of Vietnamese History in 1 Hour. I won't quite give you that, but I will go over quite a bit of, very quickly, some of earlier Vietnamese history, and then get into the 20th century, in particular the period of the wars in Indochina. So what I'd like to talk about today is not the Vietnam War in American history, which is largely what we are studying here, but rather the opposite perspective, the American War in Vietnamese history. First of all, do we know who knows who this person is in the picture? No? That is Nguyen Van Thieu, the President of the Republic of Vietnam, in Hawaii in a visit with Johnson in 1968, looking at a map of the Asia-Pacific, and one presumes staring at his own country here in Southeast Asia. To begin with, we should look at the American War in the context of 3 conflicts on the Indo-Chinese Peninsula that erupted shortly after the end of World War II in 1946 and continued until 1980. Indochina, as we'll talk about in a moment, is the term that the French used for their colonial possession in Southeast Asia, which includes the countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the initial war was between French forces who attempted to reassert French control in this region and nationalist or anti-French forces led by the Viet Minh, or the Vietnamese League for Independence. This went on until April, May 1954, when the Geneva Conference on Indochina reached a conclusion on peace on the Indochinese Peninsula and the removal of French authority from its former colony. This led to a period of division and instability within the Vietnamese region and an escalating American military presence until the first contingent of American combat forces came to Vietnam in late 1965, and that is conventionally, there are different ways of dating this, when the American phase or the American War began, which could also be called the Second Indochina War, which continued from then until the fall of Saigon, the conquest of Saigon by National Liberation Front and North Vietnamese forces in April of 1975. The Americans, as a combat force, were, as you probably know, gone by 1973. But the war is thought usually to have ended with the fall of Saigon in April 1975. Then, and this is where our poster comes in, there was not a prolonged peace, but a new period of tension on the Indo-Chinese peninsula between the newly installed communist regime in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, led by the Cambodian Communist Party, but popularly referred to then and now as the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmer. This is a term that the French gave to them. The Khmer are the dominant ethnic group of Cambodia. And the unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which became increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union. The Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian government, was backed by China. There was a series of border clashes between the Vietnamese and Cambodians over the course of the late 1970s. And then finally, a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in late 1978, which was followed by a border war between China and Vietnam in 79-80. This was a much smaller conflict, both contained geographically and in terms of the destruction than the first two China wars, but it is still conventionally referred to as the Third Indochina War. One might say that, in fact, the wars in Vietnam didn't really end until much later. There was a 10-year occupation of Vietnam in Cambodia from 1979 to 1989, and Vietnam at that time was under a very harsh sanctions regime led by the United States. The government that was supported by Vietnam in Cambodia was boycotted by the United Nations, which supported a tripartite government in exile, which included non-communist forces, royalists under the prince, then king, Norodom Sihanouk, and the Khmer Rouge, backed by China. With the end of the Vietnamese occupation in 1989 and the end of the Cold War in general, the Cambodian government then held elections in 1992, and the sanctions were eventually lifted in 1993 to 1995 by the United States, and the U.S. and Vietnam normalized relations. So we could say that from a certain perspective, the active phase of conflict between the United States and North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front in the South was a relatively small but particularly destructive and significant phase of a more or less unending conflict that began in 1946 and ended in 1995, that is 50 years. Okay, where are we? Now, let us go back then to put these conflicts in turn in a much larger historical context, and that is the overall place of Vietnam in East and Southeast Asian history. The most obvious and the most, in certain ways, powerful external force in the history of Vietnam has been China. Coming from the perspective of Korean history, I find some interesting comparisons and contrasts between Korea's relationship with China and Vietnam's. Both Korea and Vietnam were relatively small kingdoms on the periphery of China, Korea to the northeast, Vietnam to the southwest. Both, interestingly enough, were conquered by the same Han Chinese general around the time of Christ, and both were pacified. The Korean area was given the name Andong, or pacified East, by the Chinese. There is still, until the mid-20th century, a city on the Sino-Korean border called that, Andong, the pacified East. It's now called Dandong, or the Red East. And in the south, the area which we call Vietnam, or the northern part of Vietnam, was called the pacified South, An Nan, or An Nam, which is still a name used for Vietnam, and as we'll see, part of the French colonial possession of Indochina. This is a map of the Tang Dynasty in China, and you can see that in the I don't have a pointer here. Do we have anything I can use to point that out? A long stick, something? I should have brought my own. But we can see this region here, which is now part of Vietnam, incorporated into the Tang dynasty, into Chinese rule. So there are a number of competing, and in some ways complementary ways of looking at this relationship between Vietnam and China. On the one hand, there's been a great deal of cultural exchange, or what many, certainly from the Chinese perspective, would call cultural borrowing from China. The people of what we now call Vietnam, at least the literate elite, adopted Confucian principles of governance, of family ritual, philosophy, much of Chinese high culture, including the arts, calligraphy, the use of the written language, classical Chinese, although over time the Vietnamese also developed a modified use of Chinese characters for parts of the language which could not be expressed in strictly classical Chinese, which was the language of the literati. A similar process went on in Korea and Japan too, which also adopted Chinese culture heavily, and particularly at this time, the Tang Dynasty, the 8th, 9th centuries. 7th and 8th centuries. But on the other hand, China, in a certain sense, because of its very utility as a model of governance, political structure, became the focus of the creation of a sense of nationness, as it were, of political independence within Vietnam itself. And a certain kind of Vietnamese story is that the Vietnamese resisted China, or resisted Chinese domination for 1,000 years, from the Han Dynasty to the Tang Dynasty. If you look, I think, into that story, it's much more complicated than that. For one thing, who the Vietnamese are, who the Chinese are, is not always entirely clear at this time. But there, I think it's fair to say, overall, there is a deeply ambivalent history between China and Vietnam that goes very far back. And one of the profound misconceptions of the American war effort in Vietnam was that the Chinese and the Vietnamese were natural historical allies, part of global communism, but particularly the Asian variation of global communism, and they were largely indistinguishable. In fact, there were tensions from the very beginning between the Vietnamese and communist movements in the 20th century. And it should not have come as a complete surprise that conflict would come out into the open between China and Vietnam after unification in 1975, and as we've seen, even a short war between China and Vietnam at the end of the 1970s. I don't know if any of you caught the article in yesterday's New York Times about the controversy between China and Vietnam, or actually within Vietnam, about Chinese investment in Vietnamese mining. Did anybody see that? It's a very interesting story because the Vietnamese Communist Party is very bullish on inviting Chinese investment into Vietnam, but some NGOs and individuals are quite opposed to it for environmental reasons, and also for out of concern about Chinese economic hegemony in Vietnam, and the kind of, as it were, symbolic leader of this resistance, or one figure who has come out very strongly and very publicly against the Chinese economic incursion into Vietnamese mining interests, is Vo Nguyen Giap, the great general of the Vietnam War. And one of the current Communist Party leaders was quoted as saying, well, he was asked, what do you think of Giap's opposition to Chinese investment? He said, well, we have a great deal of respect for General Giap, but he's almost 100 years old, and he kind of lives in the past. So there is, from very early in this history to the present day, a deeply ambivalent relationship between China and Vietnam, and that figures in significant ways in various periods in this history, and including the war which you study in this course. There is, on the one hand, a history of cultural borrowing, a history of cultural exchange. As I mentioned, Confucianism, statecraft, written language, Buddhism, which of course originates from India but enters into Vietnam largely through a Chinese transmutation in the form of Mahayana Buddhism and classical Chinese text. There are various stories of resistance against China, the most famous perhaps being the Trung sisters from 39 to 42 AD, who fought unsuccessfully in the end against the reassertion of domination by the Han Dynasty in China and were executed for their efforts. The Han Dynasty records is where we first obtain much of our written understanding, through Chinese of course, of this early history of what we now call Vietnam. The Chinese called the people of the southern frontier the Yue, which is still a term used for a minority group within China. And those in the far south, in the Red River Delta area around what is now called Hanoi and in the environs, were called the southern Yue, Nan Yue, or Nam Viet in Vietnamese. And this is a term that over time was adopted by the indigenous people of this region themselves. The Nam Viet, the southern Yue, southern Viet people. But gradually this changed to the people of the south of Yue, or Vietnam. And that, of course, is the contemporary term for this region. Also, Dai Viet, the Great Viet people, is another term that in more recent history has been used for that. So this is the origin of that, a Chinese conceptualization of a sort of semi-civilized people on its frontier, which became indigenized as a term for the local people themselves. There is another way of looking at this history as well, which has come under criticism recently, but also has some very interesting implications for what we think about recent history of this region, and that is a kind of southern expansion of these Yue or Viet people, the southern expansion of Vietnamese culture, which has its origins in the Red River Delta in the north, but gradually moves south. It's blocked to the west because of the mountain ranges which now provide the boundary between Vietnam proper and Laos and Cambodia, at least down to the Mekong Delta. And there were various groups of different cultures, languages, religions throughout this history. And the final formation of the contemporary boundaries of Vietnam did not occur until the early 19th century and the Ga Long Emperor in 1802. If you're planning to visit Hanoi next year, there is a gala celebration of the 1,000th anniversary, they say, of the founding of the city, Thang Long, as it was called at that time, the Ascending Dragon. And this is a rather, I would say, northern-centric history, which sees a certain kind of inevitability in the extension of Vietnamese culture south until it fulfills its present boundaries. But there is much more going on, even until the 20th century, than simply a kind of natural extension of Vietnamese culture. And indeed, part of the background of the war that emerged between Cambodia and Vietnam in 1978-79 was precisely the contestation of who belongs, or what country dominates the Mekong River Delta and this culturally somewhat complicated and vague region between Cambodia and Vietnam. Now, this is not to say that the division of Vietnam as occurred in 1954 was somehow a natural division. The sense of Vietnam having a unified history and identity was certainly quite widespread and even dominant by the early 20th century. But simply that by in a way, buying into this northern-centric narrative, we tend to occlude or tend to suppress other ways of understanding this, in some ways, very complicated history. And one of the suppressed histories, as I'll get to toward the end of this talk, is the history of South Vietnam itself, which has been more or less subsumed, even erased, by the post-unification narrative of the extension of national history as Hanoi sees it. Briefly, in the third sort of area, so first of all, there is the relationship between Vietnam and its great northern neighbor, China. Second, there is the extension southward, or the interaction of the core, as it were, Vietnamese culture of the north with the people of the south. And then there is a third direction more recently in Vietnamese history, and that is its encounters with the West, which begin at least in the 1500s with traders from Portugal, Russia, elsewhere. And in the 17th century, the French, initially through missionary work, began to be involved in Vietnamese affairs. Alexander de Rhodes, a French Jesuit priest, adopted the Roman alphabet for Vietnamese language. He, I think, did not do it single-handedly, but with the cooperation of Vietnamese scholars, and that has become the written language, as we see in the poster today, of Vietnam. And by the late 18th and early 19th century, the French military interest, for a variety of reasons, not least of which was its competition with Britain, which was coming to dominate India, decided to move much more aggressively into the region between India and China, which the French called Indochina or Indochina, which was a term that became commonly adopted in the West until the middle of the 20th century or so. French Indochina was a kind of fiction that existed from the late 19th century until the Geneva Accords of 1954, which took a number of rather distinct cultural areas and lumped them together into a single French-dominated region. It wasn't a single colony, however, but it was administered in 5 regions. There were 3, what we call the 3 countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, were divided into 5 parts. Southern Vietnam, which the French called Cochinchina or Cochinchina, which was administered directly through Saigon as a colony. Tonkin and Annam, there's that term again, which were northern and central Vietnam respectively, and Cambodia and Laos, which were ruled indirectly as protectorates. And the capital of all of French Indochina was Hanoi. There was, as a reaction to this, there were, on the one hand, economic and social changes that came about through the modernization, which was a very, it must be said, limited and uneven modernization. But nevertheless, there were sometimes very dramatic changes within Indochina under French rule, both negative and positive. But also an emergence by the late 19th, early 20th century of a modern sense and a modern kind of infrastructure, intellectually speaking, and later politically, of Vietnamese nationalism. The picture on the top is from a 2007 movie, The Rebel, starring Johnny Nguyen, I believe the fellow is, kicking French butt in 1922. This, you can see the sort of continued power of this narrative of resistance and nationalism within Vietnam. And on the bottom, 2 leading intellectuals and political figures of the emerging nationalist movement, which I'll get to in a moment. So, as in colonialism elsewhere, both in French colonial possessions and British, Dutch, in Southeast Asia and so forth, there was a 2-sided aspect to colonial rule. On the one hand, changes, exploitations, but also modernization processes under colonial rule, and also the emergence of various kinds of resistance against it, which coalesced over time, in the case of Vietnam, into what became a very, it must be said, powerful movement for independence and a desire to create a modern nation by the early 20th century. It took many forms, of which I'll list two here. Phan Boi Chau, the person on the left, who was a classically trained scholar and originated what he called a Go East movement, which advocated that young Vietnamese learn from Japan and other East Asian countries and ally with them in resisting the West. That, in the end, did not lead very far toward independence. And the person on the right, who had many pseudonyms, but who is known to us today as Ho Chi Minh, was also an early nationalist figure, but gravitated toward socialism, which was coming into vogue in his time in the early 20th century. He was one of the founders of the French Communist Party in 1920 during his period of exile in Paris, and eventually helped to found the Indo-Chinese Communist Party and the Vietnamese Communist Party. We will get back to Uncle Ho, as he is called in Vietnam, again, of course. In 1940, after Germany occupied France, Indochina came under the control of the collaborationist government based in Vichy. And the Vichy rulers allowed the Japanese, which we see in the top photo, coming across the Red River in their bicycles, into Vietnam. In the same year, Ho Chi Minh forms the Vietnamese League for Independence, which is was a coalition of various patriotic groups, of which the most significant was, but certainly not the only one, was the Communist Party. And its abbreviation was the Viet Minh, which is what it became well known for throughout the periods of the French and the American wars. Toward the end of the Second World War, Japan took over Vietnam and Indochina directly. And on August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered to the Allies. Around the same time, Ho Chi Minh came back into Vietnam from China and declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd, 1945, the DRV, which is a group of Ho Chi Minh aligned resistance fighters is shown there in the bottom photo. This period of independence did not last very long, for reasons which your readings in the Vietnam War book show, I think, in some considerable detail. The Americans supported the return of the French to Indochina. The initial resistance to continued French colonization, which Roosevelt advocated, was replaced under Truman by a calculation that the more important concern in the region was the spread of communism, and therefore allowing the French to have a role in post-colonial Vietnam was preferable to allowing the domination of an independent Vietnam by Ho Chi Minh and his communists, essentially. And for reasons of prestige, economic benefit, and others, the French decided to return to Indochina and incorporate Indochina into a new French Union. This sparked a quite powerful resistance led by the Viet Minh against the reassertion of French rule. The United States, after initial ambivalence, decided to support the French. By the end of the French effort in Vietnam, the U.S. was financially supporting the French military effort to close to 80%. So although the United States was not directly involved, they were very much present in terms of assistance to the French effort, which finally collapsed with the Viet Minh victory at Dien Bien Phu, a small base near the Laotian border in April of 1954, at exactly the time that there was the conference going on in Geneva to conclude a peace in Indochina. Now, this leads to then a period of divided Vietnam from 1954 to the fall of Saigon in April of 1975. The decision at Geneva was a temporary division leading ultimately to elections within 2 years or so. By the summer of 1956 was its goal. But there was a great deal of anxiety on the American side about this. There was also a sense of betrayal on the Vietnamese side as well. Ho Chi Minh and his allies felt that the Chinese and Soviets should have supported his Democratic Republic of Vietnam as the legitimate government of all of Vietnam. But for their own reasons, the Chinese and the Soviets who were backing Ho Chi Minh compromised with the Americans. And essentially, Vietnam got the Korea solution, just as Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel in 1945 and was divided by a demilitarized zone at the end of the Korean War in July 1953. So it was thought the most expedient solution would be a division of Vietnam at, as it turned out, the 17th parallel, which roughly divided the country in half, with Hanoi, the capital of the DRV, in the north, and Saigon, the capital of a new state of Vietnam, in the south. But the attempt to create a stable South Vietnamese state was from the beginning troubled by insurgency and instability. There was a regrouping of the two sides, a very significant movement of people from the north to the south, particularly Catholics, but also others as well, who were not happy with Ho Chi Minh's DRV. And the initial head of state of the state of Vietnam was the heir to the last dynasty, Bao Dai, who was replaced, and we won't get into the complicated history here, by a series of civilian and military presidents. And at the top, as well as at the bottom, that is to say, at the level of the political structure, as well as the question of social stability, South Vietnam was, throughout its history, a society which never seemed to quite coalesce long enough to create a stable, long-lasting regime allied with the West and with the United States. This then ultimately led to the Second Indochina War, the American War, which, as I mentioned, begins in 1964 65 and continues until the American withdrawal in 1973 and the fall of Saigon in 1975. But as I want to point out, and what my article tries to show as well, it wasn't merely an American war. It was a war that, in a certain sense, was very much internationalized. It was first and foremost a war between Vietnamese, a war within Vietnam, but it was also a war that expressed the Cold War conflict globally. On the southern side, there were U.S. allied combatants, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, the South Vietnamese forces. South Korea, which sent the second largest foreign contingent, which is often forgotten. There were 325,000 South Korean soldiers that went to Vietnam over the course of this war. 55,000 at its peak in 1967, which was about 10% of the American force of 500,000, but 7 or 8 times more than the next largest group, the Thai forces, followed by Australians and New Zealanders. There were also other countries, the Philippines, for example, which sent non-combatants to aid the American effort in Vietnam. On the northern side, there was no direct military involvement of combat forces allied to North Vietnam, but there was considerable Soviet and Chinese military assistance in terms of advice and material, including very significant weaponry, tanks, airplanes, and so forth, as well as North Korean, East German, and other East Bloc supplies and support. And finally, one very important international aspect of the war was world opinion. It was the first war to be broadcast through television at a time when television became widespread in the developed West. And it was a war in which global opinion fought fiercely about and had a very important role to play in it. Not only American opinion, of course, which was deeply divided over the war, but also the opinions of American allies and opponents in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere. So the Vietnam War was not just an American war, not just an American-Vietnamese war, but also a kind of global conflict in which the involvement and the observation of people around the world was implicated in the way the war, in which the war was conducted and concluded. As I said, I would skip very quickly through the war. We have lots of time to go into the details of the war itself. But I want to get to the subject of how the war ended and how it is remembered, and also how it is forgotten, as I will talk about in a moment. The American War ended in 1975 with the unification of Vietnam, something that the Northern forces, and Ho Chi Minh in particular, had devoted great passion and energy to. Ho Chi Minh himself died in 1969 and did not live to see the war concluded. But the country was devastated by 30 years of conflict, was economically isolated, and was beset by internal and external tensions, which eventually led to the Third Indochina War breaking out at the end of the 1970s, and a continued American policy of economically and politically isolating the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The phrase used at that time, rather unkindly, was a bleeding Vietnam white, as a kind of way in which, albeit there were perhaps legitimate reasons to criticize and oppose the communist government of Vietnam, was also, I think, cannot be denied, a way for the United States to win the peace and to get, as it were, revenge on the people who defeated it. It's often been said, if you compare Germany and Japan and their post-war situations and their relationship with the United States to Vietnam, that perhaps the best thing you can do for your country is to fight a war with the United States and lose. But the worst thing you can do is to fight a war with the United States and win. And this is a lesson that the Vietnamese learned to their detriment. In the end, with the breakup of the Cold War and ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Vietnamese regime had little choice but to move in the direction of economic reform. Doi moi, or restructuring, which is basically a translation of Gorbachev's perestroika that emerged just before this, was a way in which the Communist Party could retain political control, but also open up the country economically enough to bring modernization to what had become a very backward and poor society after the war. That restructuring continues to the present. With that, in the end of the Cold War, the way was paved for eventual U.S.-Vietnamese normalization, which proceeded in fits and starts, but finally succeeded in 1995 under President Clinton. Memorializing the Vietnam-American War, let me call it that today. On the one hand, you see in the left-hand picture, we of course have the Vietnam War Memorial, designed in the early 1980s on the Mall in Washington. And on the right, a monument to the Vietnamese dead. The fatherland will remember your sacrifice, it says in the obelisk. Perhaps 58,000 Americans died. The number of Vietnamese is contentious and will probably never be known for sure, but the general figure given is about 3 million over the course of the American War, civilian and military together. There's a difference between memorializing, of course, to set up a monument to this conflict, and remembering. And the remembering of the war is a complicated affair with many sides to it. There is the official Vietnamese remembering of what the war was about, a war of heroic resistance against the Americans. We see the a poster on the left of the 30th anniversary of the Christmas bombing of Hanoi, and the people, the fist with the Vietnamese flag on the cuff, smashing an American B-52. On the right, the way in which the war was remembered most vividly for a long time after its end was the issue of POWs and MIAs, which is a complicated and very interesting story of a kind of reinterpretation of the American war with the Americans as victims, and one of the major stumbling blocks to normalization. In 1997, it was decreed that this black flag, the POW-MIA flag, had to be hoisted at certain occasions in the United States, and we still see it in many places around this country. And one of the most forgotten voices is the voice of the people of the erstwhile Republic of Vietnam in the South, which is represented by that flag on the lower right hand. Many of the people involved in the Saigon government and the system more broadly fled the country after reunification in 1975 to form the core of various diasporic communities in France, in Australia, and in the United States. And to this day, the way in which Vietnam is represented, which flag to use, is a bone of great contention, and sometimes a violent one among the Vietnamese diaspora community. But there is also a forgetting the war. Here's a street scene from Saigon, if any of you, from Hanoi, rather typical one. If you walk the streets of Hanoi, you have to learn the skill of walking through incredibly heavy motorcycle traffic without losing life or limb. Most of the people, the majority of the people alive in Vietnam today were born after 1975 and therefore have no memory of the war. And I was particularly struck this time, I visited Hanoi just a few weeks ago, at how much, even within the last 10 years or so, the memory of the war has faded. I had a great deal of difficulty finding souvenirs, even in Hanoi, that had any reference to the war at all. The war is something in the distant past that is of little relevance to people's lives today. The Vietnamese would rather move on with their economic development, with their society, and with their relationship with their neighbors and with the United States. You can see the word Doi Moi in the upper left-hand corner, very small letters in the poster, and that has been the dominant narrative of Vietnam over the last 20 years, of restructuring, of moving on, and forgetting, rather than remember the history that still remains so painfully with us here in this country, and is associated with the word Vietnam itself. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you. What should we do? Should we break for a moment, or should I would be happy to open up for discussion for a while.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, can I turn this off?